And we're live. Well, we're not live. We didn't do it live today. Sorry, I was running a bunch of errands. Didn't have a chance to tweet it out and let people know we were going to be podcasting live. So he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This is Mind Your Banners for October 29th, 2024. It is not live, but we have a lot of ground to cover. Mike, have you fully recharged from what was a rather busy week last week?
No, because I had to do a lot of driving, and you sat home and did nothing.
I didn't do nothing. I chased my child around my 2-year-old around while he threatened to poop on various neighbors. So, I mean, it's, we all have to do something. We all have to contribute in some way. It has been, as the title of the show would suggest, a busy week. It's only going to get busier. So let's kind of dive in. We're going to start with basketball and then obviously talk quite a bit about football as well. But I wanted to clear the decks on basketball. Mike, you were there at Thompson Bowling Arena in Knoxville, Tennessee on Rocky Top Sunday afternoon. Indiana 66, Tennessee 62. I thought this was a fascinating game, I'll be honest. There's still plenty for Indiana to improve on, obviously. But I think if you are Indiana, you've got to be encouraged by a lot of what happened in this exhibition game. And we will kind of acknowledge up front that it is an exhibition. I guess just first your biggest takeaways from, what you saw on Sunday.
Yeah, and I'd caution, like you mentioned, it was an exhibition, and I don't know if you watched Rick Barnes's press conference afterwards. He said that they used a lineup over the last 9 minutes that they might not have otherwise used in a real game because he wanted get some things on film and get them experience. So I think, they were sort of sacrificing maybe the sort of final score to use the exhibition like you're trying to use the exhibition where you get experience in certain things. But overall for Indiana, like you said, some encouraging things, some maybe, and I think on the flip side, there were some concerning things too. Like, Mackenzie Mbako still seems to me to be a player that, not just a complete non-factor in the first half and then couldn't miss in the second half. And, you want a guy that's a sophomore that, seemed to take step forward at the end of last year to be, more consistent, things like that. And Omar Bello, I was surprised offensively. I thought he might be a little more crisp and put together and just was very ineffective. But on the positive side, I think it starts for me, Malik Renew obviously took over in the second half, but Miles Rice is a really impressive guard. And I think he's got the chance to really, I think the team might go as far as he takes them, to be honest. I think he's a real dynamic talent. And, I was texting you and asking you how, when's the last time that Indiana had a guard like that? And you said Yogi Ferrell. And just, I was really impressed with him. And obviously I think he's going to grow leaps and bounds from where he was last year, coming off battling cancer. And wasn't sort of in, physically in, the best of places, but now, is even further removed from that. And I think is going to be a really good player.
I thought it was encouraging. A couple things. Number one, it's never as simple as 1 versus 1, but like Zakai Ziegler was SEC Defensive Player of the Year last year. He is an incredibly experienced guard. He's been around forever. The fact that Rice could have the game that he had, 20 points on 7 of 14 shooting, shot 8 free throws, 4 assists, no turnovers, against a cover like that, I think is really encouraging. I also thought it was really encouraging what Indiana was doing with him. Like, it was running ball screen offense that was built for him, not built to get somebody else a shot, but like it was setting screens for him, 3 feet behind the 3-point line. When you do that, you are doing that because you want that point guard to get downhill. If you're running ball screens, just kind of like side actions and things, that's usually more either for the screener or for somebody off the ball. When you're running that screen that far from the rim, what you're trying to do is get your point guard moving downhill. And I think there were times, well, I know there were times because it quite literally happened, where Tennessee really just could not stay in front of him. And that's a Tennessee. I mean, Rick Barnes, we'll look this up like while we're talking. Obviously, again, talked about Zakai Ziegler and what he has been for Tennessee the last several years. If you look at Tennessee's defensive metrics under Rick Barnes, they have been top 5 nationally in adjusted efficiency each of the last 5 seasons. Now, Indiana was not an efficient team overall offensively. Both teams got better in the second half. Indiana got better than Tennessee did, if that makes sense, and that's why they won the game. But my point is more within the structure of what is already a very good defensive program against a very, very good defensive player. I thought it was encouraging to see Miles Rice play the way that he did. You brought up Ballo, and I listen, this is a one-game sample and all that stuff, but it did strike me, and obviously I saw a decent amount of Umar Ballo at Arizona. I think we all did because they played a lot of nationally televised games, a lot of big games. It just struck me, though, that, like, I agree with you that I thought Ballo looked a little bit uncomfortable. Like, he kind of fumbled the ball a little bit. I didn't think his footwork was great. I was a little bit surprised at, Felix Okpara, who obviously Indiana fans will remember from his time at Ohio State, where I didn't think he was that great of a player. There were moments in isolation, anyway, when it felt like Okpara was winning that battle a little bit.
He had 4 blocks.
Yeah, I mean, four blocks. And, I mean, you don't want to go overboard with it because Ballo had 11 rebounds to Okpara's 6. But still, it did feel that way at times. But what I would say is what struck me with the complexion of the game and the way it played out was Indiana also kind of didn't need it, if that makes sense. And last year, I said this I did like the solo post-game show Sunday because you were traveling. Last year, Indiana's offense was so reliant on the 2 big lineups because its bigs were its best offensive players. And, like, the ball had to go through at least one of them most of the time if Indiana was going to get a decent shot, if Indiana was going to get a reasonably sort of successful possession. This team, I think, has still got a ways to go offensively. You talk about how Mackenzie Mbako still kind of burns hot and cold. I think you are encouraged by that second half, but you do, as you said, sort of want to look at Mackenzie Mbako and say, okay, now, but you need to do it for all 30 minutes and not just 15 or whatever. Obviously, Kanan Carlisle had a pretty quiet day, missed some open threes. Indiana as a team did not shoot well from 3. And yet you still have, Mbako scores 12 points all in the second half. I think Renew had 14 of his 21 in the second half. 2 players with 20 plus. My point is, I think there are going to be nights like this one against good teams where Indiana can look at Umar Ballo and say, don't worry about the offense. What we need from you is the rim protection and the rebounding. And if you are finishing possessions for us defensively, somebody else can handle the points. Somebody else can go score the points, make the shots, whatever. Like, it's okay, I think. And this was why I was a little bit surprised when I saw some votes for Umar Ballo for Big Ten Player of the Year in our preseason media poll. And I kind of get it on reputation, 2-time first-team All-Pac-12 player. But I just think on this team, there are going to be nights where Indiana can look at Ballo and say, just be a game changer for us on defense and then take whatever comes to you offensively because we've got other guys that can handle the offensive load. And I thought this game, while I do think, I think he had 3 turnovers. I think, Mike Woodson probably is going to ask more of him than what he played, the way he played against Tennessee. I don't know that there aren't going to be some nights when we say as a team, Indiana was successful and Umar Ballo has a game kind of like this. And we say, but that was fine because he solved a lot of the problems that needed solving at the defensive end. Tennessee only attempted 12 layups in this game. Indiana almost doubled them in layup attempts. And I think a lot of that is because of the presence Ballo has at the rim. You don't want to go there. And again, as long as you're getting offense from other areas, from other positions at the other end of the floor, I think this kind of performance is okay for Ballo. Not great, but okay.
Well, I think part of the no layups, Tennessee was settling for 3-pointers very quickly. They shot 35 of them. So some of that was by design. They were very comfortable launching threes early and often in that game. And one thing I think we should point out is that this, I'm not sure how much this will resemble what Indiana tries to do in terms of like lineups and minutes. All the starters played more than 30 minutes. They had 3 guys out. Galloway, Bryson Tucker and Ja'Kai Newton. I'd imagine they'll do some, spread that out a little more once, especially in the non-conference, to sort of figure out some different units that work. I mean, I'd be surprised, I guess, if those 5 averaged more than 30 minutes a night during the regular season.
Excuse me. Bless you. I think that's fair. Sorry, I thought you had more to go. I was just filling in.
I had a sneeze.
You sneezed. The 3-point shooting is still a concern. I don't think you can get around that. And, again, Tennessee's a good defensive team. It's also an arena that I don't think any of these players have ever played in, certainly not in college. So unless maybe, like Langdon Hatton or somebody's been there and I didn't know about it. I saw a number of Indiana fans, I think, understandably pleased at the volume that it just, Indiana missed all 11, but I think there were a lot of people that basically were just like, yeah, but we took 11 threes in one half. How many times last year was Indiana fighting to get to 13, 14 threes in a game? And they shot 19th of the game. They shot 11 in the first half, missed all 11. They were 4 of 8 in the second half. That is still something where you had guys, Rice, certainly Carlisle, and Mbako hit a couple, but he also missed a couple open ones. Goody missed a couple open ones. There are some guys there that you probably say you expect to shoot better from 3. And I think, once again, it's probably a game where Mike Woodson can point to some moments when the offense generated a good 3-point shot that just didn't go down. But like Indiana fans justifiably are not going to have any grace with bad 3-point shooting. Like it until they see demonstrable improvement, I understand anybody who's concerned that, at the first time of asking, this team shoots so poorly from behind the arc again.
Yeah, and that was kind of what they did at Hoosier Hysteria too. There were no stats, but they did not shoot well. I think they shot one early and then they didn't shoot again make one again until like the final 2 minutes of the game. So the 2 opportunities fans have been able to see this team, they have not. It resembled last year essentially.
Yeah, and again, the offense, particularly like Cannon Carlisle missed a couple open ones. I'm interested in Miles Rice. Like there's, one of the things that made Yogi Ferrell and actually Jordan Hulse before him as well really, really good at that point guard spot was how good they were shooting threes off the pull-up. So, like a lot of time, people tend to think of 3-pointers as something that are, like a function of offensive creation. Yogi Ferrell was an outstanding pull-up 3-point shooter, which meant that if you didn't pick him up inside 25 feet, he could just pull up and make one. And that was the whole possession. And so, like Miles Rice, I kind of set to one side. And obviously, he's got to improve. Last year, I think he was 27, 28% at Washington State. He's got to improve there. I think you can feel encouraged by some of the looks that you got for Cannon Carlisle, for Mackenzie Mbako, for Luke Goody. But, those 3 players shoot a combined 3 of 19 or 3 of 15. That's got to be 6 or 7 of 15 at least most nights. And listen, you can play this game with so many different statistics in terms of what if this happened or what if that happened? But like if Indiana does shoot, if those 3 players do shoot, let's say 6 of 15, which is what I think that's like 40%. That's good. But it's not, it's not unreasonable for those 3 players. That's 3 more threes. In Indiana, like the complexion of this game feels different. You aren't just saying Indiana went on the road and won an exhibition game and, against a decent team or maybe a good team. You're saying, wow, Indiana kind of put it on them. Like so many times last year, it felt like we were talking about Indiana from a position of failure or a position of weakness. I think if you're Mike Woodson, one of the advantages of winning this game is you can talk from a position of strength of saying, look at what you're capable of. Now imagine how much better it can be if we're all just 5% better than we were. And you kind of need that because, and we've talked about this, you're really not challenging yourself a ton in the non-conference. So I think you also kind of needed this game, even though it doesn't do anything for like your NCAA tournament resume or anything like that. I think from a confidence and a learning standpoint, I think Indiana needs this game and probably to some extent this result to really kind of get a good hard look at itself before, long before conference play.
Well, I think Woodson even talked about that. He doesn't want to see, they had a ton of close games last year early in the schedule. And like, this isn't a team that should struggle against lesser opponents. And he wants to see that. He mentioned coming, a very different sort of tone than he had last year about coming out of the gate and being a team that shouldn't be in those situations, outside of the battle for Atlantis when you're playing a little harder competition. But there's, probably about 5 or 6 games right off the bat where they should be winning by double digits and not have to sort of scrape and claw to escape at home with the win. And so, you don't hear any talk of, even though this team does have as many new faces as last year, or, scholarship faces, he's not sort of hedging his bets. He wants to see a better team coming out of the gate.
The last thing I wanted to ask you, because you were there, my impression was, number one, that the arena was pretty full. Number two, that it was fairly lively. Obviously, that is not going to be a full-on home court advantage for Tennessee. The game was chippy, not dirty, I don't think, by any means. In person, did it feel like Indiana at least got something approaching a genuine sort of road test, as much as you can when the game doesn't mean anything? I was surprised when they did a couple crowd shots at how many people were there and how engaged the crowd seemed to be with the game. Just because, I get it. It's Indiana, Tennessee, 2 top 20 teams. Sounded like there were a decent number of Indiana fans there, but it's also just an exhibition game. I'm just curious, did you feel like Indiana got maybe a little bit of an environmental test too?
I'd say probably the last 5 minutes. I think the crowd was sort of just happy to be there, for the first, 3/4 of the game. The lower bowl is completely full almost. There was a decent amount of Indiana fans that traveled, which isn't necessarily a surprise. But I don't think they were as engaged sort of as the, a typical crowd. Obviously it makes sense as an exhibition. But then when things tightened up and the game was, I think last 4 minutes, Indiana didn't lead by more than 4. And so every possession was sort of, the crowd was very into it. And I think that's where you probably got the sort of closest thing resembling to a road environment in that final stretch when Tennessee was trying to come back and cut the lead to 1 possession a couple of times.
Any other business from IU Tennessee?
No.
Any dining recommendations? Any?
I did. I ate at the Brass Pearl for lunch, and it was delightful. I wish I had more time in Knoxville. I'd never been to Knoxville. That was one of the SEC stadiums that I didn't get to travel when I was covering Auburn. To travel to, one of the few. But it looked
it's a fun town. It's bigger than people think it is, I think.
It is. And they have a market square. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think people think of it as a college town, understandably. And it's not like a college town in the way like Columbus is a big city that's kind of defined by the university, or Louisville's a big city. It's not that big. But it's also not Athens. It's not Auburn. It's not Tuscaloosa. It's a reasonable sized city with a lot of fun stuff going on.
Yeah, they had a market square that looked pretty neat, and obviously fans were walking around, and it looked like a nice place. So nice little spot, but only got to spend 4 hours, and then was back on the road. So it was a cameo appearance in Knoxville.
I'm sure you still sang Rocky Top at the top of your lungs. Let's shift gears, talking about Indiana, Washington, then we'll do a little bit of sort of forecasting or prep for Indiana, Michigan State. You and I talked in, I think, one of the big themes of the postgame podcast after Washington was the extent to which Indiana just kind of had to adjust on the fly. Washington threw some stuff at Indiana that it didn't expect. It's been interesting to me to sort of process some of the national reaction to this game, because I think there's, for the fact that Indiana once again never trailed, it feels like there's a bit more of a perception that Indiana got pushed in this game, and that actually Indiana kind of came out with more credit in the eyes of some national sort of pundits and opinion makers, I guess, for lack of a better term, because there was sort of a sense that, backup quarterback, offense suddenly isn't free flowing. Some things are just kind of, some things are just kind of coming a little bit harder for Indiana, and that they adjust and they win the game with a certain measure of physicality. I think there's something to be said for teams that learn how to win games multiple ways. And obviously this won't work against everyone, but I think there is value in a team that has been winning with a real level of style to maybe have to scrap a little more, to have to grind a game out just a little bit more. I was puzzled rewatching some of it by some of Jedd Fisch's coaching decisions, but Indiana can't control that. It just has to worry about what's in front of it. And I think this felt like kind of the classic, a good team.
What were you puzzled about with Jedd Fisch's coaching decision?
Well, we talked about on the post-game podcast, we talked about like how the snap counts were so imbalanced early on because Indiana had those quick drives. But then once Indiana kind of gears up its run game, something that's like 19-play drive, I think I'll look at the drive chart. I've got it up here. Indiana had a 19-play drive, a 14-play drive, and a 12-play drive. It was 24-14 when Washington punted the ball away. And that was, I think we talked about it in the post-game podcast too. Like there were still more than 11 minutes left. It wasn't a natural time to go for it on fourth down. But the flip side is then when Washington gets down, deep into Indiana territory and kicks a field goal late, and it's just sort of like, how many possessions do you think you've got left? Like with the way this game is going, it felt like if somebody had sat down and just kind of charted out the rest of the game a little bit better, they might have looked at Jedd Fisch on that fourth down and said, hey, we might kind of need to go for this. And obviously it's easy to say with the benefit of hindsight when Indiana actually got better field position off the punt than it would have gotten off a turnover on downs. I just thought, I thought Indiana adjusted to what Washington was doing. And Curt Cignetti said this post-game, and I don't know how much people picked up on it. Basically, he said Washington had been a man-to-man coverage team, and they came in off their bye week and played a ton of zone coverage that Indiana wasn't expecting and didn't prepare for. I'm presuming that was probably to be better against the run, because if you're playing zone coverage, you don't have to follow players across the field. You can load the box as much as you want as long as you're comfortable with.
I thought it was to throw. I thought it would be to throw off Taven to give him different looks than they planned for.
That could be. I thought it was because. They had really struggled
to run horribly in the second half. So
they did, but I think that, if you look at what Washington had failed at the previous 3 weeks, it was
yeah.
And if you're playing zone, then you get to decide where your players are pre-snap, not shifts, trades, motions, as our old friend Walt Bell likes to say. Point is, Indiana adjusted to that, and I just didn't think Washington then processed well basically how that changed the terms of the game. And if anything, like they were kind of given a gift on that interception that turns very quickly into a Washington touchdown. You can make an argument it was defensive pass interference one way or the other. You can't plan for getting a pick on the first play of the second half and turning that into 7 points 2 plays later. And still it did not feel like Washington adjusted to the way the game was played from that point forward. And I think it's a credit to Indiana, its staff, its players, et cetera, that Indiana did.
Well, I think we've talked all season about that. One of the biggest advantages Indiana's had is their coaching. They've just been a well-coached team. They've made adjustments really well. They've coached up players. They've coached up their depth, which we thought was a weakness. And they've sort of, anytime they've had to go to the bench, Taven didn't play great, but they got enough out of him. Every spot that they've sort of had to get an advantage, they've gotten one, and from their coaching. And I think it's part of the reason, big reason why these games have been, kind of unfolded as they have, that, Curt Cignetti's staff and, offensive staff in particular that's been together for so long has made just a really big difference with this program.
Has there been, and it's funny because I asked you for the PFF grade numbers and you said the offensive line actually didn't grade out that well from the Washington game, according to Pro Football Focus. I would still make this argument nonetheless. We've talked so much about, the transfers Indiana brought in, the staffing hires that Curt Cignetti either made or brought with him from James Madison. Like, has there been a more important retention than Bob Bostad? Because it felt like that. I mean, we talked about this a little bit last year, that it felt like that offensive line actually got better in some ways in 2023. It just kind of didn't show up in the results because of breakdowns elsewhere in the offense. That group has been, on balance, I think, really underrated to what Indiana has been able to do this season. And that's with, probably to this point, assuming Curtis Rourke's thumb injury is not that long-term, that is with probably the most impactful long-term injury Indiana suffered, right? Like, Nick Kidwell was supposed to be the starting right guard, knee injury in the preseason, out for the year. And we said, boy, they really can't afford to lose much more. And obviously, if you're Indiana, you're knocking on all the wood you can find that they don't. But, Indiana's pretty much played that starting five offensive line like every meaningful snap all season, and they have delivered pretty well. And it just, again, there's so much understandable desire, even from like national media, Big Ten media, whatever, to talk about all the new faces in Indiana. I actually think like getting Bob Bostad back and probably getting Mike Kadick and Carter Smith back as well might be two of these sort of unsung sort of wins of Curt Cignetti's first few weeks on the job, if you fast forward to where Indiana is right now.
Well, I think that's one of the reasons why Curt Cignetti was maybe, I don't know if frustrated is the right word, but disappointed that Taven kind of struggled as much as he did, because, dropped back 19 times. He's only pressured twice. They gave him all sorts of time to throw. The PFF grade for their passing grade was high. It was 85, but the rest of it was lower. That was after the last 2 weeks of having over 90 pass block grade as a group. As a man, I think Carter Smith still hasn't given up a sack, and I think there's two others on the offensive line that haven't given up a sack according to PFF. They've just been, Curt Cignetti talked about their chemistry. They've really grown together, they got two guys on there that hadn't started a game or played any sort of meaningful snaps, Drew Evans and Bray Lynch, and the group sort of came together really fast. And I don't think you can kind of understate sort of their importance. They've been trending in that direction from last year, but they still had to kind of regroup because they lost most of the line. So,
and I still think they're better than last year too. I'm just saying, like, we talked about some of the progress last year under Bostad in his first year.
But I'm just saying he laid a foundation with his coaching, and the group was improved. Yeah. And so, but they took another step and even had to add a bunch of new faces. So, it's a credit to them. In Bostad in particular, obviously, the system probably makes a difference. I don't think you can understate the importance that offensive lines had to this offensive success. Like you said.
I think we have to talk about Taven Jackson, and we'll talk about Curtis Rourke a little bit later on when we get into kind of Michigan State prep. But, I thought he had a funny day. I don't think he necessarily played great. It's funny because the interception, actually, I'm not sure is even one of the two or three sort of like worst. It wasn't a great decision, but I don't think it was like the worst decision he made all day. You walk up the field and you feel like Indiana's not necessarily in like a great place offensively. It's the first time all year I think they haven't broken 400 yards. It's the first time all year they're outgained by their opponent, and yet the quarterback does account for 2 of the 3 offensive touchdowns. Again, we mentioned a little bit Washington kind of changing some things up, whether that was to confuse Taven Jackson or it was to try and shore up some of Washington's own recent struggles, or both. I don't necessarily think – that's certainly not his best game in an Indiana uniform. I think that's probably still the Louisville game. I think that's I think we can probably agree on that the game he played against Louisville last year at Lucas Oil was probably his best single game performance at IU. But it's still like more than enough, and he still presides over, again, a game where Indiana never trails, wins by multiple scores. The game's never even tied in the second half. Covers the spread if that's big, if that's something you care about. Like, I don't know. I mean, some of this is coaching, some of this is performance. I think if he has to play at Michigan State, I suspect, this week will have done him some good. But I think if you're Taven Jackson, if nothing else, you are allowed to feel now like you contributed something meaningful to this season. You had to start a game. You had to step in the middle of the Big Ten season. You stepped in, you started, you won. And I think there's something to be said for that for a young quarterback too.
Yeah, and look, he didn't play terrible, but I don't think he played very good. And I think that, D'Angelo Pons has probably more to do with the victory than Taven does. Even Taven did throw a touchdown and run for one, but without sort of those interceptions and how that set up the rest of the game, this was close. In Washington, obviously, what was it? 17. What was
it? It was 17-14 after the pick and then the quick touchdown.
Yeah. So, I think that the defense and obviously get a big punt return sort of, I think helped IU overcome sort of Taven's struggles. And I think, just there was a lot of, some of the throws he had were really off target. And I just think Cignetti sounded a little disappointed with just how rough around the edges the performance was.
I just couldn't tell how much of that was Taven and how much of that was Indiana getting caught. Because I suspect he's also the kind of coach that I remember there was I remember that there was a clip of Nick Saban after the kick six in, what was that, 2013, 2014, somewhere in there. I think it was 2013. And everybody points out afterward the whole reason the kick six happens is because Alabama puts a bunch of big guys on the field for field goal protection. And then when the ball's out in the open field, none of them are natural tacklers and none of them are very fast. And so they all take a bunch of bad angles at Chris Davis, and he runs past all of them for a touchdown. And somebody catches Nick Saban on the sideline, and you can read his lips saying, "I told you that would happen." And I think there are coaches that just also get inordinately mad when they know that they didn't just absolutely ace the coaching matchup. And I think part of me wondered how much Cignetti was frustrated with individual players' performances and how much of him was frustrated that Washington did something A, Indiana didn't anticipate, B, Indiana, by Cignetti's own admission, couldn't really adjust to on the fly, couldn't fix, quickly. And that C sort of basically got to a place where it just required Indiana to scrap everything and roll forward. I don't know. I think Cignetti said something Jackson had some good plays. He had some plays that when he watches it, he basically made it sound like mixed bag from Taven Jackson. I just wondered if some of Cignetti's frustration wasn't at the wider performance, and maybe even to some extent, without wanting to put words in anybody's mouth, the coaching performance. And again, we're saying this about a game where Indiana still scores 31 in a conference game. Indiana still covers the spread. Indiana still wins by 2 touchdowns. Indiana still is not allowed a point in the first quarter. Indiana in this game only allowed a field goal in the fourth quarter. Indiana has still not trailed for a single snap all season. At this point, if you look at the football ESPN's Football Power Index and the projections that ESPN has there, they've got Indiana 68.4% likelihood of making the playoff. That's higher than Texas A&M. That's higher than Ole Miss. That's higher than Tennessee. That's higher than Notre Dame. That's higher than Alabama. We're talking about this, and this is, maybe the nerviest game Indiana's played this season, and they still win by 14 points. I guess maybe to some extent it also speaks to just the standard that Curt Cignetti holds, whether it's of himself, his staff, whoever his starting quarterback is, whoever is starting anything is, that it seems like Indiana comes out of this game, still sort of feeling like this wasn't good enough, even though, by the most basic and standard measures, it very clearly was.
Yeah, I mean, that's you get that from every time he speaks, he holds to those standards. I mean, that's all. Standards is basically 75% of what he talks about. I don't know. Turning our attention to Michigan State, Curtis Rourke, what Signay said was optimistic, and that his work, he's already thrown or started throwing, and his workload is going to increase throughout the week. I don't think he'd say that they were optimistic without sort of a good feeling that he probably will get the starting nod, that they wouldn't set those expectations. He's been fairly straightforward when it comes to whatever he does share about injuries, not like with Tom Allen, where he's like, well, I meant optimistic about him being alive this weekend, not the play.
It's funny because he doesn't share stuff. And I was thinking about this, even thinking back to the quarterback race, where he's we're not going to name a starting quarterback, but I'm going to say a lot of stuff over the next 6 months that tells you who our starting quarterback is. He's we're not naming a starter, but Curtis Rourke separated himself even more.
There's Curtis Rourke. There's the rest of the room over here, and they don't. Then neither they should.
Yeah, it's like a political poll where it's we're not going to tell you what the actual results were, but it was only good for one candidate. And I don't know, he's done that with the injuries. This is all I'm going to say about it. But what I'm going to say makes it very clear that things are going well. And that's what he said the last 2 weeks. He said, the only thing I'm going to say about Curtis Rourke is basically everything you want to know, other than putting the X-ray up on the screen and being well, the injury was here and we fixed it this way. The way he termed it Monday, it sounded like Rourke had already been throwing last week, and Indiana was going to be ramping up his activity this week. And that there was basically, it sounded like even more optimism than there was last week, that it wasn't a long-term injury. I mean, if you put me, you just said will he or won't he? I think Curtis Rourke plays Saturday. That was very much, and stuff can go wrong. Obviously, there can be setbacks. I don't know. Obviously, we don't know the exact nature of the injury. I don't know how many setbacks there can be when ultimately it seems like basically the question is, can he grip the football or not? It's not like he's trying to play through broken ribs or a strained hamstring, where it's he's going to have to warm up and see how he feels and take some contact and see what that feels like. Either he can grip the football or he can't. But I mean, my sense is he's going to play this week.
Yeah, and so I mean that sets up a game against a Michigan State team that you've talked up throughout the season. I don't know why. I think they kind of stink. Lost to a Michigan team that has changed quarterbacks, I think 4 times at least, I believe, obviously, because they cycled through all 3 and now have gone back to the start. But, rotated in games and are playing, I think, rotating 2 guys, giving the dual threat Alex Orji some snaps. But regardless of Michigan, we'll get there in 2 weeks. Michigan State loses that game and gave up only 200 yards of offense losing that game? Does that sound right?
Something like that.
So, I mean, there's just no way, even if Taven Jackson were to get a start, that I think Michigan State can keep pace with this IU team.
Yeah. You said I've talked it up and you don't know why. I'll be honest, I did think Aiden Childs would be better. That's a big part of why I believed in Michigan State, because I think a lot of Jonathan Smith as a coach, and Childs came with him from Oregon State, and I thought there'd be, I know he's young, but I thought there'd be a little bit more of kind of a, a level of a measure of continuity. He was pretty good against Maryland, 3 touchdowns, 2 interceptions. He had a pretty good game against Iowa, which I think is worth something. That's the last home game Michigan State played. They put up 32 points on a good Iowa defense. Childs threw for 256 and a touchdown, completed 73.3% of his passes. But ultimately, Michigan State just has not. I mean, they are average at best rushing the passer. They are well below average protecting the passer. If you look at none of their sort of statistical averages game by game are particularly impressive offensively. And I think that's the biggest thing that this comes down to is if Jackson plays, if Jackson starts, I do suspect he will be better than he was last week, just because he'll have the whole process of go through a game week, prep, start, learn from your mistakes, whatever. If I still think, then I still think it's a nervy thing for Indiana because it is one of the tougher places for this program to play. It is a rivalry game. It's almost certainly the first. I mean, I don't know, that UCLA game, there were more UCLA fans in the Rose Bowl than I expected there to be, but I think this is probably the toughest road environment Indiana's faced of the three, probably comfortably to this point in the year. But I still think that Michigan State's sledding uphill if Jackson starts. If Rourke starts and performs anywhere near what he's done so far this season and the offense goes with him, you're in a position, if you're Michigan State, where you have to pretty dramatically outperform a lot of your statistical averages and performances to this point in the season to even be able to keep pace. I mean, because this is an Indiana team that's been on the road twice this season. They've broken 500 yards, I think, in both of those games. They scored 42 at the Rose Bowl. They scored 41 at Northwestern. I mean, if you're Michigan State, you've got to be at least 2 touchdowns better off, statistically speaking, than you are right now as a team to even keep pace if Indiana is anywhere near full strength offensively. And I think that's a big ask.
Well, to highlight the disparity, Michigan State has scored 17 touchdowns in 8 games. Do you know the number for Indiana?
Is it 50 or 51? 51. Because the interception counts. Yeah, that was because I think that was their second defensive touchdown. They scored 49 on. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
So
yeah.
They Michigan State's got a nice freshman receiver. Nick Marsh is pretty good, but I mean they can't struggle getting him the ball, and so I mean like you said, that quarterback situation for a guy that Jonathan Smith rotated in the lineup throughout last season to sort of get him some run, and I think he started he didn't play the bowl game, but got a decent amount of snaps last year. Just has not. Talked about, I think, going into the opener that they were going to, be a great offense. And wasn't he the guy that said bet the over quarterback? Aiden did have not been sharp. And so, I mean, Indiana, there's just no way.
And
unless they just lay an egg. Unless they just lay an egg.
I wouldn't say there's no way. It is a rivalry game. Again, seriously, this is the toughest road environment this team has faced together at Indiana, probably by some distance. The flip side is Michigan State is coming off a pretty punishing stretch. They had Ohio State, Oregon, they beat Iowa, but then Michigan. This is the lesser rivalry game, basically, of the two they're going to play this season. It is for Indiana.
You're still convinced you're giving them, you're holding to.
I'm giving them a chance, but like I said, I expected Michigan State to be better offensively than it's been, and at a certain point, I know teams can change over the course of the season, but at a certain point, you just kind of are what you are. And 8 games into a season, I don't think you're just going to flip a switch. Now, I do suspect that Iowa game is probably, going to be appointment viewing for Indiana. I think Indiana is going to want to know what it was about that game that really kind of, turned up. But even in that game, Michigan State, kicked 6 field goals like that. I mean, even that game felt as much about Iowa and Iowa's own problems offensively as it did Michigan State. I don't think there's a world where, especially if Curtis Rourke starts, Michigan State can afford to, can get away with playing the field goal game when it's got a team in Indiana that can probably score a touchdown in just about any possession.
Indiana hasn't given up 6 field goals all season, which is I just think there'd have to be so many failures across the roster, it's just something we haven't seen. And maybe the quarterback situation, if Rourke takes a hit on the thumb or something and that throws a wrench in it, I just think something would have to go wrong for them to lose to a team that's been playing. I mean, look, Michigan State's defense had as good of a game as you can have against Michigan, and they still lost. I mean, it wasn't like it's just they can't score. They just can't score.
There's not something that like you hang your hat on. I mean, I guess they're okay. They're top 3 in the conference in opponent red zone conversions. I mean, I guess that works. I guess that's okay.
That works.
But like, it's just, like there's not something. It's not like they're amazing against the run, or they've got a really dynamic pass rusher, or I mean, even Childs. Like, the other thing I thought about Childs was that he'd kind of make them a little bit more dynamic offensively. And again, I know he's a young guy, like he is. I think he's a true sophomore, or maybe a redshirt sophomore. But like, it just. Especially if Taven Jackson plays, it's on the road. He's young. Obviously, we saw him struggle at times last week. That throws kind of a gremlin into the system that you're not sure about, and you just kind of need to see Indiana work through it. But I'm not. First of all, I'm not at all convinced Indiana can't work through it. Second of all, if Rourke starts, I just I don't know where you go. If you're Michigan State for, I don't know where you go for your, for the number of points you're going to need to keep up with, maybe the best offense in the Big Ten. They've only scored more than 27 points against an FBS opponent. They beat Prairie View A&M 40-0. They've only scored more than 27 points against an FBS opponent once. That was Iowa 2 weeks ago. Indiana, by comparison, has never scored less than 31. Like, not one time. And that's, and the 2 times they did that are probably the 2 games that we would look back on and say where they were like the most sort of like wonky offensively. First game mistakes, last game, backup quarterback had to kind of scrap some of the game plan. You never know. And you don't know, like, is there going to come a point when all this becomes too real for Indiana? I don't think there will be, but like, you're never sure, right? Like, you never tomorrow's the concept. You never know.
I did not take that into account. I did not take that.
Like, tomorrow is the concept, and we should change the name of the podcast to Tomorrow is a Concept.
The only thing that you mentioned, a mobile quarterback, Indiana really hasn't had to deal with that. Like, if they had changed their gun, but I mean, they haven't done that all season. Michigan State, I think the most yards Childs has is like 50 yards, 11 carry for 50 yards. But if they did something like unique like that and like try to throw them off and just, it's hard to imagine, to go to a whole, different game plan to take advantage of that when they really haven't done that all season. Looking it up, he's only had double-digit carries twice.
He was good in the BC game. He can do it, but like when they've played a good defense, he's not been able to. So Michigan, 8 carries for 6 yards. Oregon, 12 for 29. Ohio State, 6 for -9, which obviously is going to be affected by sacks. But the point is, like, when they've played teams that play good, sound defense, Michigan State has not been able to take advantage of that.
Well, my point is that Indiana hasn't faced that, so maybe that it takes them a half to get sort of, like it's something different. But like you said, they just haven't executed that very well. So it's not like, I don't think you have to be like on the lookout for it necessarily. I mean, you're conscious of his athleticism, but it's not something where you feel like even if they, threw a new game plan out, and try to trick Indiana, like you said, their coaching's been so good. They'll just make the adjustments and get through it. I just don't see it. I mean, maybe, I guess you give them a chance. I don't know. We'll see.
I mean, I
you sound daunted. This is against their motto. They're never daunted.
It's not my job to be daunted or not daunted. It does seem like good seats are still available for this game. I'm looking on Vivid Seats right now, and most of the stadium is relatively open. So I don't know what kind of road environment you're going to get, but listen, it is the toughest road game Indiana's played to this point. It's a fascinating warm up for the final 3 games, because what I would say is, and obviously not, not Kurt Signetti won't do this, but you and I can do this because tomorrow doesn't have to just be a concept to us. I have kind of told people like this game is the inflection point where I think you should start talking about the playoff if you're Indiana. Like if Indiana gets through this game undefeated, then that's when I think the playoff becomes a real thing. Because when you're 6-0, 7-0, yeah, if you keep winning, sure, you'll get to the playoff. But like it becomes much more of a here is the path. And you start being able to narrow down some Big Ten tiebreakers. And obviously Ohio State plays Penn State this weekend, so that's going to have an effect on the Big Ten race. In fact, I think if I'm not mistaken, that's the last time any of these four teams that are kind of at the top of the Big Ten will play each other all season. So like it's kind of the last big, wrench in the system, so to speak. But I just think like it.
Well, Ohio State plays Indiana.
Well, okay, fair, but I'm talking about outside of Indiana's control or outside of like how it would change.
Nodding, and I'm thinking that's not right at all. But okay, continue.
But either way, this has always felt like the one to me. And again, part of it is also it's a rivalry game. Like Indiana has not had a ton of success. I think they've only won once at Spartan Stadium in like the last 20 years. And these two teams did play each other every year in the old Big Ten East. And I think they were in the heady days, the legends and leaders. I think they were in the same division then as well. I'd have to go back and double check. But the point is, like, this is it's the toughest road game Indiana's played yet. You do have some uncertainty at quarterback. It's not been a place that's been particularly kind to this program.
Twice at
It's always felt to me like a game where if Indiana's still undefeated through the end of this game, that's when I think you can start talking in a non-theoretical but like very real way about the playoff.
Just to correct your stat, they've won twice in East Lansing since 2020.
Okay, I'm not counting the COVID year. I'm sorry. That like the COVID year is just its own thing. It's very different.
Okay, but I think
that game 2 years ago was wild though. Indiana trailed by 17 points like twice in the fourth quarter or something.
Wasn't that the Dexter Williams game?
Yes, and Michigan State missed a field goal. It was a chip shot field goal, and I stayed back because I think there was a home basketball game that night or something, and I was watching it on TV, and like I've never seen a kicker that even just like staring at the back of his helmet on the TV broadcast, I could be like, this kid there's no chance. They would have a better chance pulling someone out of the student section and asking them to attempt the kick. He's not going to make it.
But how far things have changed, right? You stayed home to not cover football. I mean, a lot of what you're saying is like, I mean, it's not this Indiana team, right? Like rivalry game past, like what does it matter? Like Kurt Signetti's not going to give, what.
I get that, but to quote our good mutual friend Mike Glasgow, they're Indiana football until they're not.
I mean, have they not? They've not been that this season. I
don't know what
the fighting Kurt Signetti's. That I don't know what else they need to do to prove to you that they're not. It's like to me, it's that all that stuff goes out the window with this staff and what they've done, and I think they've earned the right. I mean, they've won on the road. What's the Rose Bowl? They one of the rare teams to have win 2 time zones away. They won at that little pop-up rink on the river.
On the river.
Whatever, on the lake.
Michigan River.
On the lake.
A wide river.
I think they've earned the benefit of the doubt in terms of like this isn't whatever the history of the rivalry is. I just don't think that matters.
Maybe. You might be right. We'll finish with this just to keep it simple. Like, do you think Curtis Work plays Saturday?
Yes.
I do too. All right. We'll leave it there. We will both be in East Lansing. We will do our post-game podcast, etc. We'll do it live as planned, provided we can find a place in Spartan Stadium press box to do it, which I'm sure we can. But until then, for the Indianapolis Star, for the Bloomington Herald Times, he's Mike Niziolek. I'm Zach Osterman. This has been Mind Your Banners. Thank you so much for listening. We look forward to talking to all y'all soon.